Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Have you ever wondered why two graphic cards with the same GPU can have a huge price difference? On paper, they both use the same NVIDIA chip, so why is one so much more expensive than the other? What are you really getting when you pay for?
To find out, I borrowed two RTX 4090 from my friends. We picked one of the biggest price gaps you can see right now in the high-end consumer market, the RTX 4090. On the cheap side, we have a card from Inno3D, the RTX 4090 X30C, which sells for around $2,150. This is basically one of the cheapest 4090 you can buy. On the expensive side, we have a card many of you know very well, the Asus
ROG Strix RTX 4090
OC. Its price is around $2,700. Same 4090 GPU, but the price difference is about $550. With that gap, you could almost buy a whole RTX 5070. So what does this $550 actually get you? In this video, we're going to answer that in detail. We'll test gaming and productivity performance at stock settings, check power draw, temperatures, and noise. We'll also take both cards apart to look at the PCB, cooling design, and build quality, and we'll see how far each one can go when we overclock. There's a lot of info in this video. We tested for almost 10 days for this one, so I think this deserves a like, right? First, let me quickly introduce our test platform. We did not use an open-air test bench. We used a normal closed case with two case fans. So this is closer to a real user setup. Room temperature was 25 degrees Celsius with air conditioning. The motherboard is an ROG Z690 Hero. The CPU is an Intel i9-1390K with a 360A I/O liquid cooler. RAM is 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6000. Let's start with what everyone cares about most, gaming performance at stock settings. We set graphics to the highest settings, tested at 4K, and recorded the whole run with a capture card. We tested 5 games in total, 2 online games and 3 single-player titles. In games, the FPS of the two cards is very close. The
ROG Strix
is a bit faster, but not by much. In online games, the ROG card leads by about 0.79% on average, and in 3 games, it leads by about 1.54%. So the difference is very small. If you watch the FPS overlay carefully, you might have noticed something. The clock speed of the ROG Strix card is usually higher than the Inno3D X3. Why? When you buy a non-Founders Edition card, some models have an OC in the name and a higher price. These cards come with a factory overclock. For example, the Inno3D RTX 4090 X30C is based on the reference 4090, but the boost clock is increased by 60 MHz up to 2580 MHz.
The ROG Strix 4090
OC is pushed a bit higher to 2610 MHz. It also has dual BIOS with a physical switch on the PCB. One mode is quieter, and one runs higher clocks and more performance. But in the gameplay footage you saw, the actual in-game frequency is even higher than the specs. That's because NVIDIA cards have GPU boost. GPU boost will automatically raise the core clock depending on power, headroom, and temperature. So do you have to buy an OC version to get higher clocks? Actually, no. All graphics cards can be overclocked manually. The OC models only have the OC profile written into BIOS for you, so you don't need to set it yourself. If you want to overclock manually, you can just download software like MSI Afterburner and adjust the sliders. In other words, we can also manually push this cheaper Inno3D X30C to the same frequency as the ROG Strix, or even higher. So we did that. We raised the clocks on the X3 to match the ROG Strix and then tested the FPS again. In some titles, the X3 was actually a bit faster, but overall it still slightly lagged behind the ROG Strix. Then we kept going. We pushed both cards further to see their overclocking limit. On this generation, if you really want to go serious overclocking, you normally also tweak voltage, but to simulate how most normal players use their cards, we only raised the power limit and temperature limit in Afterburner, and slightly increased core clock and memory clock. In the end, these were the stable OC results.
The ROG Strix RTX 4090
OC got plus 130 MHz on core with a final boost around 2740 MHz. The Inno3D
4090
X30C got plus 170 MHz on core with a final boost around 2750 MHz. So surprisingly, the Inno3D X3 could actually run 10 MHz higher than the ROG in our overclock. For memory, we added plus 600 MHz on both cards. So, with both cards at their stable OC limit, how big is the difference now? In online games, after max OC, both cards gained about 3% versus their own stock performance.
The ROG Strix
is still just a tiny bit faster, but the gap is not huge. In 3 single-player games, even in well-optimized titles like Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Red Dead Redemption 2, the gap between the strongest and weakest results is still under 5%. In Cyberpunk 2077, which is harder to run, the gap is even smaller. It feels a bit disappointing, right? Especially for
the ROG Strix.
We unlocked the power limit to 600 watts, but it still can't pull away from the 450 watts X3. Why is that? Let's look at the logs from Cyberpunk 2077. You may notice something strange.
The ROG Strix
is actually hotter than the X3. Isn't the more expensive card supposed to have better cooling? The cooler is clearly bigger, so why is the temperature higher and the performance difference so small? Where did that extra $550 go? To answer that, we need to look inside both cards. As we all know, high-end GPUs often represent the top level in build quality, performance, and noise control. From the outside, the design of these two cards is very different.
The ROG Strix
has a more refined and cyberpunk-style shroud, RGB on the side logo and the rear edge, supports Aura Sync and uses more metal on the shroud. The Inno3D X3 feels more basic, the surface texture is more rough, it only has a simple white lit logo on the side, and the plastic feeling is stronger. But to be honest, I kind of like this simpler design too, because it's smaller and lighter and the size difference is noticeable. Of course, looks are subjective. The important part is the build and cooling. Let's open them up. First, the cooler design. On the
ROG Strix,
the back of the card has large cutouts for airflow. On the X3, the rear is more closed off. The heatsink on the ROG is clearly bigger than on the X3. After removing the backplate and PCB, we can see that both cards have a reinforcement frame in the middle. The PCB is quite small on both, much smaller than the old 30 series cards, and the integration is higher. This leaves a lot of open area under the backplate for airflow. Looking at the heatsink itself, both use a nickel-plated base, vapor chamber or cold plate, heat pipes, and aluminum fins. But there are some key differences.
The ROG Strix
uses 4x8mm heat pipes and 3x6mm heat pipes, while the Inno3D X3 uses 9x6mm heat pipes, soldered to the fin stack. So in terms of heat pipes, it's almost a draw on paper. However, there is a big difference in the vapor chamber area. On the
ROG Strix,
the vapor chamber is much larger. It covers not only the GPU and memory, but also the power delivery components near the output side. On the X3, the chamber mainly covers the GPU and memory, and doesn't care as much about those VRM components. Also,
the ROG
uses a vacuum vapor chamber that is machined with grooves, so the heat pipes sit in it directly. This way, they don't need to flatten the heat pipes, and the contact area is larger. On the X3, they flatten the heat pipes first and then press them to the base. After grinding, the pipe wall becomes thinner, and over long-term use, heat pipes like this may form empty spots inside and lose some efficiency. The layout of the heat pipes is also different. On the X3, like many cards, 2 of the pipes are heavily bent in the evaporation area to increase efficiency. On the
ROG Strix,
all 7 heat pipes run straight across the fins, with more fins in both the hot and cold sections. The fin stack fully fills the area between the hot and cold zones. The X3 still uses a more old-school segmented fin layout, which sacrifices some heat transfer area. For the fans, both cards support fan stop at low load and alternate spinning for better airflow. Max fan speeds.
The ROG Strix
goes up to 3000 RPM and the X3 up to 2800 RPM. But to be honest, this difference is not important, because in real use you almost never run them at full speed. At full speed with no load, the X3 hits around 54 decibels and the ROG Strix goes all the way to around 61 decibels, which is very loud and hard to accept. In real use, At normal curve settings, you don't want these speeds. For most users, the default fan curves already give enough airflow. So on paper,
the ROG Strix
does have stronger cooling design. So why is it hotter? Let's check power and clock. At stock,
the ROG Strix
pulls about 50 watts more power, and its core clock is around 200 megahertz higher. More power plus higher clock means more heat. So, of course, the temperature is also higher. But the truth is, both coolers are kind of overkill. NVIDIA originally planned the RTX
4090
with a 600 watt plus cooling target, but thanks to process improvements, the final TDP is only 450 watts. Most AIB partners designed their coolers for that original 600 watts idea, so now most
4090
coolers are overbuilt. As a result, even basic
4090
models have no real thermal stress. NVIDIA nerfed the 4090 headroom, so throwing more heatsink and more VRM at it doesn't give a huge FPS boost. Higher power limits also don't help much because the power limit wall is there. This is the real reason why the flagship and the cheapest
4090
look so similar in FPS. So if performance gap is small, what are you really paying for on high-end models? A big part is power delivery quality. In daily use, this is hard to feel, but we can see it clearly once we look at the PCBs. Here is the PCB of the Inno3D
4090
X3 OC, and here is the PCB of the ROG Strix
4090
OC. Besides the same AD102 GPU at the center, everything else has a lot of differences. Most obvious, the Inno3D X3 OC has 14 power phases for the GPU, while
the ROG Strix
has 24 power phases. That's about 70% more phases. When people talk about beefy VRM or better power delivery, they don't just mean more phases. The quality of each component also matters a lot. A simple view of one power phase looks like this. 12 volts from the PSU comes in, passes through an input filter, enters a switching circuit controlled by a PWM controller. MOSFETs turn on and off quickly to step voltage down to around 1 volt for the GPU. The output then goes through inductors and capacitors again to clean noise and stabilize the current. And finally, a stable and clean low voltage goes to the GPU and memory. So 3 parts are very important: capacitors, inductors, and MOSFETs. Capacitors stabilize voltage and remove noise. Inductors stabilize current. They need to charge and discharge many times per second and directly affect current quality. Both cards use solid capacitors and sealed chokes, but on the
ROG Strix,
the inductors and capacitors are custom parts that Asus calls super alloy power. They also add polymer capacitors on both front and back of the PCB near the output filter. These have very good high-frequency response, which helps keep current even more stable. The Inno3D X3 does not have this extra treatment. MOSFETs are even more important. They are the heart of the power delivery. The more current they can safely carry, the higher the GPU power limit can be. Today, most GPUs use DORA-MOS, which packs high-side and low-side MOSFETs together in one chip. Both cards use DORA-MOS, but on the
ROG Strix,
each DORA-MOS can handle 70 amps, while on the X3, each one handles 50 amps. So when you combine more phases, stronger MOSFETs, better inductors, and better capacitors,
the ROG Strix
has a much stronger and more stable VRM. This is why it dares to support 600 watt power limits, while cheaper models often hesitate. Even if we don't unlock 600 watts, we can still see the difference in long-term stress tests. In a 20-loop 3D mock test,
the ROG Strix
has more aggressive power and clock behavior both at stock and OC. The X3 is more conservative. The Strix keeps higher and more stable clocks, but the cost is higher temperature and higher noise. In a 10-loop test for noise, the X3 is around 47 decibels, and the
ROG Strix
is around 55 decibels. In games, the pattern is the same.
The ROG Strix
is on average about 5 degrees Celsius hotter than the X3. Better VRM also means more heat in the VRM area, which adds to the total temperature. Let's also look quickly at productivity software. For video work, in the Adobe Suite and DaVinci Resolve 18, the 2 cards trade blows. Sometimes
the ROG Strix
wins, sometimes the X3 is close. These tools don't always keep the GPU at 100% load all the time, so the difference is not huge. But if you look closely, you'll notice that under extreme overclock, the X3 sometimes regresses. It performs worse than at lower clocks in some tests. This shows its stability at high OC is not as good. in industrial or 3D software like Maya and Siemens NX. This behavior shows up again, and the difference is more obvious. In pure GPU rendering tests like V-Ray GPU, you can clearly see performance scaling with clock speed. In Octane render, once you enable RTX,
the ROG Strix,
stronger VRM and higher stable clocks help it pull far ahead of the X3, while the X3 with heavy OC again starts to fall behind. Putting everything together, the differences in cooling and power delivery do bring some performance gains, but the FPS gap is still small in most real-world gaming tests. Why? Because most 4090 coolers were designed for 600 watts, but the real 4090 is capped at 450 watts. NVIDIA also locked the power headroom, so no matter how good your cooler and VRM are, you can't go past that limit by much. Pushing power higher just creates more heat, without big FPS gains. This is why the flagship and budget 4090 feels so close in performance. So you might ask, if the gap is so small, are high-end 4090 just a waste of money? I don't think it's that simple. High-end cards are more expensive, but the cooler design, VRM quality, and build quality are all clearly better. Not only do they perform slightly better, they also usually have better stability and longer lifespan. They also come with extra features. Dual BIOS, extra fan headers at the tail, case fan sync or brackets, and more aggressive factory tuning. And don't forget another use case, undervolting plus overclocking. Even if 600 watts doesn't make sense, you can undervolt the GPU and keep good clocks at lower power, like 450 watts. With a strong cooler and VRM like the ROG Strix, you can keep similar or better performance while lowering temperatures and reducing noise. On cheaper cards, the headroom and stability for this kind of tuning are usually weaker. On the other hand, the budget 4090 still have good enough VRM and cooling, no big problem with performance at stock, and very good value if you only care about FPS per dollar. You just need to accept rougher build quality, higher noise, slightly worse long-term stability, and weaker brand image. If you don't care much about these things, a cheaper
RTX 4090
is totally fine, and the money you save might be enough to upgrade your CPU one tier. So here's my simple recommendation. If you care about brand, build quality, stability, and lifespan, and you can accept paying more, then high-end
4090
like the
ROG Strix
are worth it. They almost have no major weaknesses. If you mainly care about price performance and you don't mind a bit more noise and a simpler design, then the cheaper
RTX 4090
are the smart value choice. Performance is still very strong and FPS is not far behind the flagship.
Alright, that's the full comparison between one of the most expensive RTX 4090 and one of the cheapest RTX 4090. After watching this video, which kind of card would you choose? Let me know in the comments. If you find this video is helpful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. See you next video. Bye.